On behalf of the Ancient Tree Forum, welcome to another of our webinars in the series covering the VetCert standard at practicing level. This session covers Unit 3, which is about roots and the soil environment. Please remember to make a note of any questions you might have as you go along and save those for the complementary question and answer live sessions that will be run relatively frequently. So roots of veteran trees in the soil environment, which is Unit 3, is divided up into 3 subunits about the natural soil environment and tree health, the factors that might have an impact on veteran trees, and where roots and mycorrhizal fungi grow. So we'll go through each of those in turn. The first one describing the natural soil environment and how this affects tree health. So under that section, the first point is you need to be able to explain the importance of a healthy soil environment and why veteran trees are susceptible to changes in this environment. So this is about how changes might affect natural cycles, so nutrient movement, recycling processes, the fact that soil is a living ecosystem. There's a huge number of organisms involved and living in the soil, healthy soil at least. And the fact that trees are such long-lived organisms, they've been present, in particular veteran trees and ancient trees, have been present on a piece of land for a long, long time. They can't easily move to new areas, if at all. So rapid changes in land use, both globally and locally, in climate condition, for example, can have an impact on the soil and thus, as a consequence, on the veteran trees, because they basically are restricted to that particular location. And this is an illustration to kind of give you a bit more information about that, which you're welcome to look up yourself, why it's important to have a healthy soil. And this is in relation to both the chemical processes and the biological processes, how bacteria are involved, worms, oxygen, the impact of fertilizer, and so on. So this is information just about why soil and healthy soil is important. And of course, the roots are such a crucial part of our trees and often the part that's overlooked. So the second part of this section is about that you should be able to describe a variety of soil types and their influence on the rooting environment. So this is the soil triangle here, showing that we have silt, clay and sand, and that it shows you kind of the percentage of different elements in that triangle regarding particle size, the proportion of air and water, and how that might potentially impact on the rooting environment of a tree. And that's something you would be expected to be able to describe at a relatively basic level. And just to illustrate the point, the fact that they have different characteristics. So clay, for example, has small particles and not a lot of oxygen, and sand, on the other hand, has large particles but holds less water and less nutrients. So just to kind of give an indication, you should be able to understand and be aware of those differences. So the second section on this unit is describe factors which can have a detrimental impact on the soil environment around veteran trees and recognise these in situ. And by that we mean that you need to be able to recognise what's happening on site. And this is divided up into under sections in here, under 2, which is demonstrate an awareness of the effects of deficient or excessive nutrients, pollutants and contaminants on veteran trees. So the impact of, for example, you need to demonstrate an awareness that nutrient deficiencies will have an impact on tree growth. Now, this is not just veteran trees in general. And that nutrient excess, for example, with high levels of nitrogen, will have an impact on the symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. And then pollutants and contaminants, of course, they will alter the soil biology and chemistry and potentially can be toxic to tree roots and mycorrhizae. And these are relevant for all trees, but specifically veteran trees in terms of the speed at which these things happen. You need to be able to describe different types of soil damage and demonstrate an awareness of how their actions, as in your actions as a practitioner, may impact on soils. And I guess the obvious ones are compaction and erosion, and your work sites and methods, as in how you access the trees, where you have your vehicles, where you have your materials and other factors. So it's understanding that there are these different types of soil damage, and some of those can actually be created by poor practice. So compaction being removal of the air spaces within the soil, leading to anaerobic conditions which can result in waterlogging and root death. Erosion, where the soil actually disappears, it can expose the roots. Changes in soil level can lead to similar conditions to compaction, that you get anaerobic conditions. And this can also lead to changes in water levels as well, and access for water. Obviously, things like ploughing are much more significant, and this is an example of the impact of activity in relation to veteran trees, ensuring that there's distance for the root system so that compaction doesn't take place. And that's something that you ought to be aware of and able to identify, particularly in relation to your own activities. An example of where heavy overgrazing has clearly exposed the soil and potentially compaction as well as erosion taking place. And this is something you ought to be able to recognise. And the third element to this is identify how and where roots and mycorrhizal fungi grow. Now, we know this is notoriously difficult, but in terms of for the practitioner, you should be able to show an awareness of common root architecture patterns and how root development is influenced by the rooting environment. So this is that the majority of roots are anchor and feeding roots, that it looks more like the base of a wine glass sitting on a plate than as a mirror image. But we also know that change over time, that roots move and die and new roots grow, and they have a more lateral spread over time. So that's the kind of thing we're looking at, the distance from the trees and the depth at which they're generally found, and that it's a dynamic process, that roots do evolve and change over time, just as the crown does. It's influenced by external factors, clearly, as well as the local factors too. And here's an example of that here's a tree that hadn't been it was in permanent pasture and then was ploughed up, and you can see the person here on the right hand side. That's actually, they're still finding roots from this tree after this first instance of ploughing. So we often talk about the rooting environment being 5 meters outside the crown, which would kind of be somewhere here. And it's the same again, distance of still finding reasonably sized roots. You need to be able to explain the relationship between roots and shoots. And I guess that's a relatively simple point here, that they're directly linked, that, there's a balance between the root and the shoot volume, and impacting on shoots will impact on the roots in turn. And that signs of ill health in the crown may also be related to root damage and water availability or nutrient uptake. So they're directly linked, and that's something that you need to be able to explain. And here's an example of a tree that's showing severe dieback in the upper crown. It's also got a thinning crown, probably related to root damage as a consequence of ploughing, even if there is a small buffer here. Then you need to also show an awareness of the symbiotic relationships between tree roots and other organisms and explain their benefits. So we're talking specifically about mycorrhizae here, obviously, and also bacteria, and that this is a relationship between two or more organisms, and both benefit from this relationship. So mycorrhiza and tree roots, for example, fungi get the hard to reach nutrients, and things like phosphorus in particular, and the tree gives the mycorrhiza carbohydrates. So it's a very beneficial relationship for both organisms. There's also a difference between different tree species and the type of mycorrhizal associations they have. Then also bacteria can be nitrogen fixing bacteria, can be very important for some of the tree group species. Just an example of a mycorrhizal fungal fruiting body that can often be fruiting quite far from the tree as well, giving an indication of how far some of these finer roots extend. There's also a short film that the VetCert project have produced about mycorrhizae in particular, so if this is something you feel you need to learn more about, then that's a very good place to get some more information. And the final element for this unit is show an awareness of the problems associated with identifying actual root location. Well, the most obvious one, of course, is that they're hidden by the soil, and they may even be under tarmac. They're often opportunistic, so even if there is a relatively standard expected pattern for root growth, it's very often altered or amended based on the current conditions. So physical barriers, for example, which might be, let's say a wall or huge boulders, or it may be a road which has been dug down and has some kind of casing underneath which has stopped the roots from growing. And that very often, of course, the only way to find roots is to dig down. There are other tools and mechanisms available to help identify where roots grow, technological things, technological equipment, I should say, to help you identify where roots grow. But they just an awareness of the problems in relation to actually identifying where they are. So finally, just an overview of some of the resources as usual with regard to this particular unit. There's chapter 5 in Helen Reid's book is about management of the land around veteran trees, and chapter 3 in David Lonsdale's book, which is protection of tree sites and surroundings, and they are available to download at the Ancient Tree Forum website. There's a fact sheet that's been produced on mulching if you're interested a bit more in the types of management in relation to root systems, although there's less of that required knowledge for the practicing level than there is for consulting level. And then the video that I've already mentioned, there's also a vet tree video, which is the importance of the land around a veteran tree, which is worth having a look at. That gives a good summary and overview of the types of knowledge that you would be expected to have for this particular unit. Then there's also some articles in the ARB Association's magazine about root protection areas for veteran trees. There are 2 articles in the spring and the summer of 2018, but they can be downloaded also from the Ancient Tree Forum website. So that's the quick run through of Unit 3. Next time we'll talk about Unit 4, which is veteran trees as ecosystems. Once again, remind you to make a note of any questions that have popped up in your head, and we'll pick those up at the question and answer sessions. Thank you, and see you next time.